Hey everybody, and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program RP-0. We have a lot of bit to get to today, so here's the point where I turn on the rocket engine sounds and proceed with the super sped up footage. So today's objective is to get Rosalina Memorial Station on the lunar surface up and running again, which first means resupplying Tremonia Station in low lunar orbit. This is a whiskey resupply pod. Not that it carries only whiskey, although there's probably some on board, but that was the next letter in the alphabet. So it is basically an adapted version of the landing pod that we usually use to resupply the surface station. We've just added a docking port and removed the landing legs and made a few other very small adjustments as far as what kind of stuff it carries with it. But it did need a little touch-up from the HG3 on the B upper stage to get itself into a circular orbit, which is fine. We've got lots of overhead here, and it isn't really a problem, but the resupply pod itself is actually heavier than the version that lands on the surface. Carries more supplies. I think we did a little bit of a trade-off, but considering we don't have to run that ELE engine for an extended amount of time to make orbital insertion, I think the added mass is well worth it, considering frequency of supply runs might be increasing depending on how well things go. And here's our translunar injection and engine cutoff. Just a little low, but we are off on our relative inclination by quite a bit. Not a big deal. We will start the orbital insertion burn on the B upper stage using the last little bit of its fuel, whatever doesn't boil off, I suppose. And a very nice scenic view as we float carefully away from Earth. Never gets old, really. Although it might not be the most majestic spacecraft, it is certainly worth its weight in tonnage. Anyway, back to business. Kerbal Alarm Clock will get something going for us, and we'll also start the rollout of our next launch, which is, of course, a surface resupply. We'll be getting through that at similar pace, and we'll swing ourselves around and light that engine to make orbital insertion, and then have a failure to decouple, of course, and then have to wait for signal reacquisition once Earth comes over the horizon, and put ourselves into a decent orbit, and then we'll drift out a little bit to correct for our relative inclination at the best point that we can, really, which is not all that great, but a little bit of fuel balancing, because soon enough we'll be doing some docking. So we're just going to wait a few orbits to make a matching burn, or at least get ourselves much closer to the station. So that requires a very small touch-up here at apogee to bring our apoapsis, to bring our periapsis up to something that works better, and some weird patchwork graphics here on the moon. I don't really understand it, but then again, I guess I don't really have to. So there's the burn to lower our relative inclination, and then we're just going to touch some of this up on thrusters as we try to bring our separation at closest approach down to a much more reasonable level. And finally getting it down to about, less than a kilometer. Certainly I always try to shoot for around 200 meters. Just makes things nice and easy, and it's only a 40.5 meter per second burn to adjust our relative inclination, of course, which I will handle late. But we've got some good runtime left on our engine, and because it has such a wide gimbal and a good throttle, it's relatively easy to correct. Put ourselves on target for the station. We're just going to go ahead and dock with the massive fuel tank there sticking off the side, because that's probably the only docking port where this thing will actually fit, which is why we put them there in the first place. So we'll start to make our approach nice and easy. The solar panels were left tucked in, thankfully. We don't have to switch vessels to go take care of that. And then try to get ourselves lined up with the docking port as best we can before just easing ourselves on in. Yeah, we're a little bit off angle, but a little bouncing on the thrusters after backing off just once without having made contact, which is not really my SOP. But there we are, docked. And so now we will transfer over as much resource as we have brought, which is life support and fuel. We need to put a little bit back in this resupply pod to deorbit it. So we will undock, and wow, those thrusters are effective when there's next to nothing in it, and then just let it pile into the moon. Second launch today is a resupply pod for Rosalina Memorial Station, actually on the surface, and we did update our fairing textures for this launch, unlike the last one. I think both of them have gone up on a DN5B, I guess we'll call it modern, for the updated boosters that have 3 RD-172s on them now, although it would not make me a better pilot. We do have to up angle a little bit to keep from running past our time to apogee, although we were able to walk it down to just under a second before it starts to run away from us. And then there's the light of the HG3 upper stage that will complete our orbital insertion. Just like last time. So we'll go ahead and shoot for the cheapest burn possible to put us on lunar injection. And that would be 2 launches in 5 days, both bound for the moon for the space program, which may not be a record for this program, but it was still quite a feat for me. And there's a fantastic view screaming across the Earth as we make our ejection burn. Does surprise you sometimes. Anyway, all 4 radiators up and kicking. Hopefully we can keep some of this liquid hydrogen around so that we can make our orbital insertion at the moon with a lot of it still intact. There's the best view we were looking for. Spit off into the distant Earth, thank you. And just a quick check to see what it would take to make a single pass landing. It's not really worth it on the Delta V side, but also forgetting to kick on the antennas caused us to go way past periapsis in making this orbital insertion. Although we are still able to get into orbit, we are now on a collision course with the moon, so we will have to actually raise our periapsis up to not collide into things, and then time warp a whole bunch through about another, we're at 20 days since launch now before we can actually start to make our approach to Rosalina Memorial Station. So first we'll lower our orbit down, put ourselves on a nice approach about halfway around, screaming a little close to the surface there, coming sometimes within 4 or 5 kilometers of the surface. Gotta keep mission control on their toes somehow, I guess. Anyway, there is our burn to make our landing approach, and a quick touch-up plus a node to give us a nice estimation on how much time this burn is actually going to take. Of course, we'll probably be doing it in lots of steps. A burn to slow down, we'll wait until apogee starts to get ahead of us, and then shut the engine off and try it again. Of course, with little touch-ups here and there to make sure that we are still on course. We do have to correct normal and anti-normal a few times just to make sure, but here we are, solid approach. So it's a pretty good bit of aiming, and then try to kill off the rest of our horizontal speed and set this down hopefully within 25 meters of any particular item on the surface that we can hook a fuel line to. Of course, now we can see all that debris out there also as well, and the frame rate drop doesn't look so bad, all massively sped up. And here we are, final approach, a lot easier with the engine that throttles, and touchdown. So we're going to consolidate all the fuel and lock the tanks just to make sure, but that does it for this part. And for the last part of today's episode, we're going to be flying our brand new Shuriken Mark 6K. We do have some parts that we need to bring out to both the Nemo and the Dory. These solar panels that I broke off last time, but I forgot if they're the Type 3s or the Type 4s, the bigger ones or the smaller ones. So we're just going to pack what we can, which is 2 big ones and 4 small ones, and then get ourselves out to the launch pad. So I will turn you over to Old Me for live launch coverage. Well, overdid that by just a little bit, but I think we've got the margins to make up for it. So the first and official maiden flight of the Shuriken Mark 6K. We are loaded up and ready to go. Throttle is set to full. SAS is on. Ignition. Good light on all engines. Clamps off. A little bit of wiggle off the pad. No big deal. let him gain some altitude and speed before we start leaning into this gravity turn and make our ascent actual to Kawaii Potato Station. Let's hope this works as well as it did in the simulation run. We can actually start leaning back now and heading in the correct direction and start adjusting for our angle. Oh, that's an interesting little bit of shimmy. Probably due to me messing with it. But we'll get this sorted out here shortly. Nope, wrong way. Let's go this way. Nope, that is the wrong way. So that was SAS fighting me. Per usual. Come on. Let's get that number down. Overall, the first phase of the launch went exceedingly well. It handled me tossing it around, trying to get that relative inclination down to an appropriate level extraordinarily well, and with way less wrestling than something like the SKS or the first variant, or really the Mark V, Mark 1 through Mark 5 variants of the Shuriken. This is a much more well-behaved ascent vehicle. I just wish I had been paying attention to our apogee the entire time, although that heat warning I did not notice in times before. There's a booster sep. They are cleared away, and we are now just on our 3 HG3 engines currently, as we'll start to angle down now that we're clear of any parts of the atmosphere that might seek to wreak havoc on our fuel tanks. And we're going to try to keep that apogee somewhere around the 250 kilometer mark, because that is where Kawaii Potato Station is, although it will be largely, I don't want to say unsuccessful. We don't go crazy with it, but we're able to keep a pretty marginal balance. The station is way out ahead of us, so we're going to be making many, many laps to try to line up our orbits eventually, or at some point, I should say. So even with the angle down and the time to apogee growing closer and closer, we still do have plenty of margin. I did worry for a little bit that maybe I'd flown this so badly that we were actually going to not make it to orbit on the main engines, but small spoiler, I guess I was a little bit wrong on that count. We're actually able to level it out just a little bit more, and once I start paying attention to relative inclination again, we'll start walking that down, get it to about 0.03, well, between 0.05 or so. It does vary quite a bit because I can only do one or two things at a time, just not walking and chewing bubblegum. And there's main engine cutoff, 359 by 267. Not bad. There's enough variance in our orbit to where we can allow ourselves to catch up to Kawaii Potato Station. We will be making a slight adjustment, but first we need to transfer the stockpile of aerosine and nitrogen tetroxide into the orbiter itself. It is kept in the EFT for balance reasons during takeoff or launch and descent, and looks like there's a whole bunch left over, which I was not prepared for, so there's a little bit of me checking around pretty much anywhere I could, trying to figure out where the hell that fuel is supposed to go, but I can't quite find a home for it. I assume it's excess for ballast, or maybe it's there so that I can run the RCS on the way up. Anyway, there's liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen for the fuel cells. We can move some liquid hydrogen over. There's 2 life support tanks there in the bottom of the cargo bay. Those are fine. We'll get our solar panels extended, and still no home for that excess aerosine and nitrogen tetroxide. But we've topped off the hydrogen for our fuel cells, and we'll go ahead and jettison the EFT and unlock some of our OMS fuel, primarily the center tank, so that we can try to maintain balance. We've got a 7.4 meter per second correction coming up to put at least one side of our orbit on equal altitude with KP station. So we'll get ourselves angled into that. We will stage in properly our AJ-10 at some point so that we can have gimbal. That would be certainly a good thing. And just a little bit more touching up. I'm trying to keep it as on point as possible while trying not to have our relative inclination go all wonky, although, you know, good luck with that. So we will start taking laps while we let our closest approach node get closer and closer, and then finally it's almost lined up, so I will start to plot out a node to intercept, fully forgetting to fully take ourselves out of time warp, which after a whole lot of tweaking the node around and eventually getting something that almost looked like 1.8 kilometers distance, we will just kind of blow right past it. Yeah, I wish I had been paying a little bit more attention to that, but you know, these things do happen. So instead, 204 meter per second correction seems a little bit wonky, but we'll take the node as a guidance point, a hint, if you will, since it's almost related directly to a orientation. And I will wildly swing past it. Apparently there's a lot more thruster power keeping us pitch up than there is to pitch the nose back down, which I found very interesting. But we're basically just going to keep an eye on that separation of closest approach. It will grow quite significantly at first. That is to be expected, but we have gobs and gobs of Delta V available to us. I'm hoping not to use all of it because that fuel is supposed to be there to supply either Nemo or Dory for their trip out to the moon. It's basically designed to bring up a full load of fuel supplies and a crew so that Nemo or Dory can make their trip out to the moon without needing an independent supply run to keep the station topped off, which is extra nice and a very valuable asset to this vehicle in general. Also the reason why it needs 3 HG3s instead of the Mark V's 2 HG3s. So again, we will be I replotted the node thinking that this wasn't working as well as I thought it should. So we're going to reorient ourselves and then just lean on thrusters a whole lot. Actually leaning on engines also, but that node did not work as well as it had when I plotted it. So we, after a quick burst to the main engine, we will basically just be leaning on thruster ports and watching that number sink a whole lot. But I think a new guidance node is definitely warranted. This is probably the most trouble I've had trying to get an orbital rendezvous in a very long time, but I blame it entirely on me just blasting right past that node, as I really wish I hadn't. But we do have some encounters that are bouncing around somewhere a bit. They seem to work out, and I think just basically by watching the separation of closest approach and trying thruster directions at random, I can get us down to something a little bit more usable, and it looks like it's going to be mostly radial out, which indeed, on firing the engine, starts to make that number fall fairly significantly, although at the cost of our relative inclination, which is just fine by me, really. And honestly, we have quite a lot of lean room on that apogee, so more energy that we can kind of put there. We will have to bleed it off later, but we do have lots of room to make this work and lots of Delta V to correct for a speed difference between the two vessels once they actually do get together sometime in orbit. But our separation of closest approach is falling. We're just going to ignore that node and stay pointed radial out. Seems to be working quite well, although this footage is sped up quite a bit. It was real slow going for me and my co-pilot as we made this maneuver, but down to about 5 kilometers we'll kill the engine and resort just to thruster pushing now, which takes nearly twice as long as just firing the engine. But holding the H key to go forward no longer decreases the node, it actually increases it. So had we kept the engine running pointed in this direction, we would be making things worse. So lots of just holding buttons and very slowly walking that number down. And so for the interest of sanity, I have gone ahead and sped pretty much the rest of this up so you don't have to watch me holding keys making small adjustments on thrusters. Eventually we do get a relatively solid closest approach, and we will plot a node to zero out that velocity at the appropriate time. make a quick check to balance some fuel around, and then warp right around to our separation at closest approach, where we will light our main engine and slow most of the way down. We're going to leave some of that velocity there, and there she is, Kawaii Potato Station, and close enough to where physics warp is kind of dangerous and too far away to use standard warp. So we'll just coast on in nice and slow and try to get ourselves lined up for one of those docking ports. We'll make ourselves a swing around to line up appropriately and then start to guide ourselves on in. And it was relatively slow going despite the sped up footage, but we will eventually get ourselves pretty well lined up. This is still sped up, just not nearly as much, so don't think that I was actually moving close to the station at these kind of speeds. Yeah, we'll just try to get ourselves evened up here. The orientation of the docking ports on this station does make it a little difficult to gauge my approach visually. And I know what you're going to say. Go ahead and say it. I'm still going to laugh. Anyway, folding the solar panels in would have been a good idea about 10 minutes ago, but, you know, we just do what we do, and those do look like the larger solar panels, the Mark IVs. So we can get one of these vehicles up and running this run, I suppose, but we'll need another resupply to fix up the other one. I think we're going to fix up Dory first, because she still needs her inaugural run out to the moon. We can leave Nemo for next time, anyway. And coming up on almost contact, there's a little bit of a nudge, and docked. Fantastic. And not nearly as bad as I thought it would be. Anyway, I will transfer some resources around off camera, and next time we'll be patching up the Dory and making our way out to the moon. So anyway, that's going to do it for this episode, everyone. Thank you so much for hanging out. I really do appreciate it, and I will see all of you in the next one. So until then, see you later.